I was actually watching a cooking show not that long ago. And the chef there was really trying to, besides, teaching technique and, and trying to instruct and, some little tips that would make your meals better. He was trying to impress the importance of being bold. Being bold with your flavors, with your textures. There's something about your dish. Every dish should have something that just stands out, that just pops. And it could be the spicing, it could be the seasonings, whatever you're doing, we don't want boring. There's nothing worse than boring food. And actually, I had an example of this since I watched that. It was during Thanksgiving. If your Thanksgivings are like ours, the family all kind of meets. Everyone brings a different dish, or they supply something different to the meal. And Lisa, it is her calling to bring cranberry sauce she makes authentic cranberry sauce, and then she also brings the can because most people don't like authentic for some reason. But this year she found some dried cranberries at the store, so she was going to bring them, and I forget how we were going to use them, but wouldn't you know it, we're packing up the meal to go, and I forget either they got left at home or they were in the bottom of the cooler, but the meal's done and there's a container of cranberries. What are we going to do with dried cranberries? Well, it was a month later. It was actually around New Year's. We kind of had a little family gathering. All the kids come over. They like to stay up. Their excuse, they're not going to school, so they can stay up to midnight. We had we grilled some chicken. We made a salad. We had, food for everyone. And we thought, well, we got cranberries to use, so why don't we just take the dried cranberries and throw them on our salad? This changed my life. I just want to let you know. A little bit of sweet, a little bit of tart on a normal salad I liked. All of a sudden, I love this salad. It is a mainstay in our kitchen now. But just boring, safe is boring, and we don't like it. We want something to give us some flavor to our life. Now, this doesn't have to be food. It can be decorating. You find yourself watching a decorating show, which I really try to avoid, but I love my wife and I watch the things she watches because of that. But normally they will tell you, in the room you have the decorators like, oh, we got to hang this piece of art, or we have to paint this wall red, just because something in the room needs to be bold. Something needs to make a statement. For fashion, you can wear muted colors, but make sure you got a nice flashy tie, which I really don't. But, have an accessory, have something that just jumps out and says, here I am. Now, I actually got this instruction earlier in life from a different source, and this was when I played ball. I had a coach who was trying to teach me, and if you understand playing ball, and it doesn't have to be baseball, it can be any sport you're in, you got a lot of life lessons that are built in that you probably don't realize till you become an adult what your coaches were trying to teach you. But I was a good player, but I was a very conservative player, and I would run from station to station. I would never be thrown out at base. I'm just one of those things that I played consistently, but I played by the rules. And I played with the fear of not making a mistake. And he told me on several occasions, and then one day he just had to be right out there in front. He says, no, you have to be aggressive. You have to play this game with the mentality, you make the other team make a play. When you run the bases, you get as many as you can. Take second if you can on a single. Make them throw you out. If you have a chance to score, take it. Don't give them an easy base. Don't walk them because you're afraid they're going to hit the ball. Let them hit the ball. Let them do what it takes to beat you. Otherwise, you're going to do what it takes to win. And when you have that attitude, you're going to win more often than you're going to lose. And it really brings us down to managing risk. And this is something all of us face throughout our life. And it can be early on when we're trying to decide who to ask to the prom, and we're nervous, and do we find the person we have the crush on and ask them, because you have a risk there. They could always say no. They could always say yes. You'll never know. Sometimes it's safer to not know, and then in your mind you can imagine that they like you. But once you ask them, you know the truth, whether they even know you exist or not. But, we have these experiences where you have to choose what college you're going to go to. You have to choose what career, what kind of job you're going to get. And sometimes the choices you make very young in life can have long-term ramifications. If you're planning for retirement, you understand the risk assessment you make. Do you want to invest in something that's safe, or something a little more risky but can give you a much higher return. That is our life. It's about managing how much risk we want to take, and we understand we really do have to take some risk if we want to accomplish anything. It's a necessary part of being human. And the word caters to those who take risks. You think about the entrepreneurs. You think about those who, build the better mousetrap. They have this gadget that they invest their money, or find people to invest the money. They build the factories, they build the machines, they do the marketing, they send it out, and if people like it, they can be millionaires. If people don't like it and don't buy it, they can go bankrupt. It's a risk that they take. Now, you could always just work for somebody else. You could always just work for a salary, work for an hourly wage. It's safe. It gives you a good living. You'll have a decent life, but you're not going to be extremely wealthy or extremely successful when you're constantly just doing the safe thing. Of course, you're not going to fall flat on your face more than likely either. Explorers, we admire people who will get on a boat and sail off into the sunset, or just, throw a pack on their back and just head out west somewhere. If you've ever, the PBS has this little documentary on Lewis and Clark. It is fascinating what they did in literally just getting on horseback, getting on a canoe, just going out west and seeing what's there. And there are no cell phones. There are no telegraph, no way of being able to communicate with the outside world. They could trip on a log, fall down a cliff. No one would be there to help them. And just to have that sort of courage to go out. And for those explorers who succeeded, and we've named countries and continents after them. We understand with the risk comes the reward. But it is not something that the timid can do. It takes courage. And if you remember that old television show, how did it start? To boldly go where no man has gone before. We have our Star Trek reference thrown in. But this is something, part of the whole show was this is an adventure, but it takes people who are courageous. It takes people who are willing to take risks. I did have a grammar teacher, or an English teacher in high school, who loved that opening, because he used to open up his classes by saying, we are going to boldly split infinitives. No man has split before. Just a little shout out to your grammar geeks out there. But you understand, this is a ploy people use. Okay? Advertisers use them. They will misspell a word. Okay? Why does fat get spelled P-H-A-T? I know there's a reason there somewhere, but a lot of people, a lot of businesses like to do it. They know it will catch your eye. They know it's something that, ooh, that's different. Actually, you remember years ago that ad, I guess there were commercials at that time, there were billboards as well, said, think different. Okay, if you were like me, Lee, you were waiting, that think is a verb, different is an adjective, adjective modified nouns, you need an adverb ends in ly, think differently, that's the way it's supposed to be said. But of course, I remember it, because it was wrong, and so you have this cognitive dissonance in your mind, something's wrong, it's not right, you remember it, that's what advertisers want, so you remember them. Honestly, I don't remember the company who did it, but I do remember their advertising scheme. There is a risk, because you can look stupid. You can look uneducated. You look at how they're spelling those words. They don't know what they're talking. So that can get transferred, but the reward is people will remember you. We talk about the meek inheriting the earth. The meek don't change the world. The meek do their thing, and they are constant and reliable. But it takes courage and it takes vision to forge a new way. So here's the question. Is boldness a part of our faith? For that, I'd like you to turn to Hebrews chapter 4. We actually have a segment here where this issue is brought up. We're actually going to break in the middle of the chapter. Anytime you see the word therefore, you know that the author is making a conclusion. So we're going to pick it up verse 14 where it says therefore. He's been talking a while now, and he comes up to his conclusion. This is Hebrews 4:14. It says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, and yet without sin. So we have this conclusion. We have a priest who has passed through the heavens. We understand that Jesus Christ was divine, the Son of God. So we have someone who has seen the highest of highs. But at the same time, we have one who has been tempted in all things. We have one who came and lived in the flesh. He was a man. He has seen the lowest of the lows. And because of this experience, and he overcame this, we should hold fast to our faith. We should have a certain confidence because we know someone. He's been at the top, he's been at the bottom. But here's his conclusion in verse 16. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Because our Savior is powerful and humble, we should approach him with confidence. Now, if you have a King James Version, or maybe a New King James, you might notice it reads a little differently. This is the way I memorized it when I was young and in school, and I had teachers that made me memorize Bible verses. It says, therefore let us come boldly to the throne of grace. And this is something for years has kind of tickled the back of my mind, because going before God's throne is not something we should do boldly. You should be humble, you should be careful, a little trepidatious, meaning respectful, certainly. But telling us that we should approach him with boldness. If we truly believe our faith, if his promises are truly to be trusted, if he is as good as we think he is, then mercy and grace will always be available when we need them. And we should have that confidence when we approach him. Don't be timid. Don't shrink back. And if you read through scriptures and you see how God deals with those whom he calls, you do understand he usually gets more angry with those who do shrink back, with those who won't step forward and do what he asks them to do. So here's the question. Are we? Are we bold? Are we confident? You know, there is a certain stereotype. And if you watch a lot of TV, especially sitcoms, you usually have the stereotypical Christian. Okay, and if you're familiar, I see some heads nodding, you kind of know they're always portrayed as very conservative, and this can be socially conservative or politically or morally. They're usually a little meek, they're a little, wishy-washy. They have this conflict within them that they see all the wrong things in the world, so they can be a little judgmental. But at the same time, they know they're supposed to forgive people, and so they kind of, they don't have a strong, confident demeanor. There's always usually something a little conflicted about them. But in a word, they're usually portrayed as boring. Okay, that's the way believers are. They don't drink, they don't dance, they don't have any fun at all. And if you're a fan of Billy Joel, you know that line, I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints, because the sinners are just more fun. And that just seems to be the accepted view. This is what a Christian is. This is what a belief in that faith will lead you to. But our faith should give us confidence. It should make us more courageous. We should dare to live life more fully, knowing we have someone powerful behind us to back us up. Now, to be fair, I've known believers like this, but honestly, most people I know of the faith, they do live fuller lives. They do take a little more risk because they have, at least if it's not confidence, they do have a faith that God will take care of it. If they make a mistake, they have a safety net. I think part of the confusion here is understanding grace. And from our background, that's not something that has always been preached, at least not to a full degree. But understanding when we need grace, I think, is often overlooked. Because usually it is, well, when you sin. You make a mistake. You're selfish. You are, a little bit, you act in a manner that is self-centered, it is dumb, it is foolish, and that's where we need forgiveness. But I want you to think about it from a different perspective. I'd like you to turn to Mark chapter 5. We have various examples of people who came to Christ and had their lives touched by him. Some of them were, to be honest, the people that followed him, usually they needed a miracle or they wanted to see a miracle. And so you had people with this expectation. And in this passage, we actually get a 2-for-1. We get two people within the crowd who are needing something from Jesus enough that they took action. This is Mark 5, verse 21. It says, Jesus crossed over again, and in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and so he stayed by the seashore. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up, and on seeing him, fell at his feet. And he implored him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she will get well and live. And he went off with him, Jesus went off with him, and a large crowd was following him and pressed in on him. So we have all these people following Jesus, and they see this man who's very desperate, and understand that circumstance. His daughter is deathly ill. And desperation will push you to be bold. Desperation will push you to do things that you might not normally do. Even prostrate himself. Now this is public. This is kind of a very intimate moment where someone is in pain. They are in desperate need of help. They're going before someone they believe can help them, and there's a crowd. They have an audience. And so understand, this is kind of a sensitive place, but everything here is being noticed. So even more so, he's prostrating himself. He's begging. And while this was happening, there was someone else in the crowd following along. Verse 25 says, a woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years. She had endured much at the hands of many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. And after hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. For she thought, if I just touch his garments, I will get well. And immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her afflictions. So here she is, following along in the press with the crowd. She reaches out and has this thought, if I can just touch him, that will be enough to heal me. And you understand how bold that was of a move in that society. That was a risk, because a woman just doesn't go and touch a strange man in public, especially a man who was as respected as Jesus was, being a rabbi, being a teacher. And that's a little too familiar, a little too presumptuous to walk up and touch him. And not even considering the fact that, according to a strict interpretation of Mosaic law, if she was bleeding, she would be considered unclean. If she touches Jesus, Jesus is considered unclean. That means he can't just go back to the synagogue. He can't go to the temple without going through the ritual cleansing. So there were some social barriers, serious social barriers, she just trampled right over. But it worked. She needed healing. She thought if she did this, she could get it, and she did it, and it worked. And in that case, it really, as unreasonable as it sounds to just touch his cloak, it worked. And you kind of have to give her credit. She got what she wanted. She felt that she was healed. Somehow there was an exchange of power. But she wasn't the only one who felt it. Verse 30 says, immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that power proceeded from him and had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? All right. He didn't know what was going on, but he knew something happened. Now, this to me is more fascinating than anything else, just dealing with the fact that Jesus can heal someone without consciously doing it. I mean, just the ramifications of just understanding how the power of God works, it opens up so many doors to so many questions. I'm not going to say against his will, because that doesn't mean that if she would have asked that he wouldn't have gone out and healed her, but without his conscious choice. She was the one who initiated the contact. It was her reasoning that said this would work. And it all happened without Jesus being a part of it, other than just being there and being that conduit of the power. As I said, it raises many questions. So, he looks around, sees the woman who had done this, and he said, but the woman, fearing and trembling and aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. So we have the situation where he could have been angry. He could have said, how dare you touch? How dare you do this? You have no right. He doesn't. He looks around, sees her, and she's a little sheepish. I'm guessing this is the first time she might have realized, okay, what did I just do? Because this was, this was bold. This was an act of desperation. But she didn't ask. She took. She went in, she touched, she got the healing. This is when a person needs mercy. When they're doing what they think is right, when they're pursuing a course of action, this is necessary, this is important, and they take a few liberties. They step over a couple boundaries, they push a little too far. Their intentions are right, but they can, we know what they say about good intentions, okay? You can cause a lot of problems with good intentions. But this is the time when a person needs grace, when they're doing what they feel they should be doing. And they go a little too far. They make a mistake. They push too much. As I said, he could have said, How dare you? He could have called her on, but instead in verse 34 he says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. You know, I think, reading between the lines, he was taken aback a little bit. I think he was a little surprised that it worked out this way. But he recognized her faith. He recognized she had the courage to act. And because of the faith and the courage and the action, she received the healing. You know, boldness allowed this woman to find healing. She found the courage to dare the impossible. She took the big risk, and it paid off. And you can't help but think, how many people out there that have needed a miracle, have needed healing? They have prayed and prayed and prayed, sometimes for years. But that prayer never moved into action. And they never got that miracle. And you wonder, is the Spirit waiting? Is it something that, you know, there are people who desire healing and never find it. And is it just a matter of times of they needed one more step forward. They needed to put their prayer into action. And that possibly being a little more bold, they would have found the answer they needed. And on a different note, how many times has the world been ripe for change, where the conditions have been terrible, when everybody knows this is bad, this is, you know, whether it's political, whether it's religious, whether it's social, we just know that, you know, the way the world is, it's not right. Who's going to change it? No one stands up to initiate that change, and it continues on. Now, I want you to think about this, because we have a story in the Old Testament. This is in 1 Samuel 14. This is coming from the days of Israel when they had King Saul, but they were also subdued by the Philistines to the point where they were not even allowed to have a blacksmith. Okay, because the Philistines were afraid if they have a smith, they could make weapons, and if they're making weapons, then they might rebel. And so they had to go take their tools to the Philistines to get them sharpened. In fact, I think there was only 2 people who had a sword in all of Israel. That was the king Saul and his son Jonathan. It is a bad situation. And people were praying praying to God for, relief, for, rescue from these enemies. So, chapter 14, verse 1, it says, now that day came, the day came that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to a young man who was carrying his armor, come, let us cross over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side. But he did not tell his father. So we have this confident young man, and how should we say it? Looking for trouble. Come on, the armor bearer, he had a squire, he had a sword, one of the few people who did. Let's just go over to the camp of the enemy. See what happens over there. So what does happen? Verse 6, it says, then Jonathan said to the young man carrying his armor, come, let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by many or few. And his armor bearer said to him, do all that is in your heart, you yourself, and here I am with you according to your desire. Head of your loyal man with him. And so Jonathan said, behold, we'll cross over to these men, reveal ourselves to them. And if they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand in our place and not go up. But if they say, come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hands, and this shall be the sign to us. Now, I'm sure that there's a lot left unsaid or unwritten there, but just reading the text, he was not given this sign from any. He was making it up on the spot. He was just being very presumptuous of he wanted to initiate something, and you know what? He would not be the first man to start a fight expecting someone else to come and pick up the pieces at the end. Perhaps God will start something. Perhaps if we start something, God will finish it. This was bold. In fact, you might even say this was reckless. But they did start something. Verse 11, when both of them revealed themselves to the Philistines, they said, behold, Hebrews are coming out of their holes where they have hidden themselves. So the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer, and he said, come up to us and we will tell you something. Here's that sign he was looking for. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come after me, for the Lord has given them into our hands. Then Jonathan climbed on his hands and feet, and with his armor bearer behind him, they fell before Jonathan. And even his armor bearer put some to death. At the first slaughter was about 20 men within about half a furrow of acre, and there was a trembling in the camp and in the field and among all the people. Even the garrison of the raiders themselves trembled, and the earth quaked, so that it became a great trembling. So they did start something, and God did back them up. I mean, not only were they victorious on 2 men against 20, but all of a sudden the earth quakes, and then there's a feeling of unrest within the camp of the enemy. Read further and you'll see there was a great battle, and the Philistines were routed. This was a momentous event, but it came from a very reckless decision, a very bold and courageous decision. God blessed the risk, and He used it to accomplish His work. He did redeem His people. He did free them. It was a bold attitude that was needed to change that situation. And you wonder, how long would have this continued until someone like Jonathan said, let's just see what happens. Let's just roll the dice. Let's just do what we know, what we think is right, and trust that God will back us up on it. It took courage, but I'm going to say this. If you read the story, it probably took more courage to face his father than it took to face the enemy. Saul was proud. He was king, and his word was law. And during the course of all this, we won't read, I'll leave it to you to read the details, but during the course of all this, Paul made this decree, this vow saying, we will not eat, no one will eat anything until we defeat the enemy. Until this battle's done, until we're victorious, we will not eat a thing. Even fortuitously said, even if my son breaks this, he will be put to death. And knowing how the story goes and knowing how Scripture works, yeah, Jonathan didn't know, and he did eat, and he did break that commandment, and Saul wanted to kill him. Strange as it sounds, but that was the kind of man Saul was. I want to read one verse. This is verse 45 near the end. It says, but the people said to Saul, must Jonathan die, who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. People overridden the king's decree. They had had enough. They saw what happened. They knew Jonathan was the cause of this. And they also knew Jonathan deserved a little slack. Okay? Grace is deserved for people who will take a risk, for people who will push the boundaries, for people who will do what is needed to be done, and if they're not perfect, that's okay. We'll step back a little bit. Our God is not like King Saul. Our God, like any good king, He knows there's a time to enforce the law, and then there's a time to step back and set it aside for something a little more important. And that grace is reserved for those who will risk much in the pursuit of what is right. We have this saying, it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. Now, how many of you have said that? I know I've said it several times. Now, I want to ask you this. When you say it, do you, in the back of your mind, know you're not going to get permission to do this? So in a way, it's kind of a justification. No one's going to let me do this if I go before my parents, my administrator, whoever the authority is. They're going to look at me and say, have you thought this out? Have you considered all the ramifications and the consequences? No. So you rationalize, this has to be done. And so I'm going to do it, and when it's done, I'll ask forgiveness because they're going to see what my motivations were. They're going to see what the end result was, and we kind of hope and pray they'll realize, no, you did the right thing, and they'll forgive you. And and that's an understanding that people who are courageous should not ask permission from the timid, because we know what the timid are going to say. Okay, to be courageous means you act knowing the consequences might be dire, and that's part of the bargain. Is the forgiveness may not be there, or the consequences may be so high that it may have been better that you didn't act. And that's the risk. Being bold is a risk, because everything may not work out in your favor. But I can't help but wonder, what are some of the things we could accomplish if we had that attitude of this is wrong or this is right, we need to act, we know there are consequences, but the end result is worth it. So let's move. And we have the faith to back us up that says God will be there. If we're being led in that right direction, we think we are following Him, then we will know He's there and He'll back us up. There is a movie, it was decades ago. Usually I don't say it shows my age, but even in this case, we have a crowd who will probably remember this movie. Remember Oh God? With John Denver and what's the older guy, George Burns, who played God. To me, it was a funny movie. Some people found it a little irreverent, but there was a scene, George Burns is playing God, and here John Denver has this list of questions to ask him. If, all of us can imagine having a chance to talk to God face to face and asking him the big questions, and one of the questions he asked is a legitimate one. People have been asking for generations. Why do you allow so much evil in the world? And I thought the writers were brilliant in the way they responded, because the response from God was another question. Why do you? Okay, and understand, we love to complain about the state of the world. We love to look around and say, that politician is a liar, and that businessman is greedy, and that famous actor is a hypocrite, and we just look around and see all the problems in the world. But how many of us, or how often, do we actually try to do something to make it better? We're more comfortable just complaining. For those who want to do something, are we waiting for God's Spirit to move us? Are we waiting for a sign? Are we waiting for something external to say it's okay to act? Or is God's Spirit waiting for someone to get moving before it acts? That's a good question. What things is God waiting for someone else to initiate? This is our world. As Mom used to tell us, it's our bed. We make it, we have to sleep in it. There are many kinds of external motivations for action, and I've gone over a few. There's sickness, there's catastrophe, there's persecution, and certainly desperation can push us to be a little bit, out of character, to actually be a little more aggressive in finding a solution. But I want to talk about a different kind of bold before I wrap up. This one is in Acts chapter 4, and this is in a time, this is shortly after the death and resurrection of Jesus. We have the day of Pentecost, we have the apostles who were going out. All of a sudden, they're filled with the Spirit. They are performing miracles, and they are witnessing in a mighty way. And in Acts 4, we pick up the story where the authorities arrest Peter and John. Okay, in verse 13 it says, "Now as they observed the confidence of Peter and John, and understood that these were uneducated, untrained men, they were amazed, and they began to recognize them as having been with Jesus." These are Galileans. They never went to college. They never got a degree. How on earth are they speaking these very important and profound truths? And two, how are they performing these amazing miracles? And weren't these disciples of Jesus? And we know what we did with Jesus. And seeing the man who had been healed standing with them, they had nothing to say in reply. But when they had ordered them to leave the council, they began to confer with one another, saying, "What shall we do with these men? For the fact that a noteworthy miracle has taken place through them is apparent to all who live in Jerusalem, and we cannot deny it. But so that it will not be spread any further among the people, let us warn them to speak no longer to any man in this name." So they couldn't understand where the confidence and where the power was coming from. But the miracles were real. But the popularity of Jesus was also becoming a nuisance. That was very real too. Now this man they thought they had got rid of, his name besides his body is now, his name is being resurrected, his ministry is now coming alive, it's getting a popularity. And this is something they wanted to stop. So they had this little compromise. We won't punish them, but we're going to tell them strictly, severely, do not speak anymore in the name of Jesus. Verse 18. "And when they had summoned them and commanded them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus, Peter and John answered and said, whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge. For we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and what we have heard. And when they had threatened them further, they let them go, finding no basis on which to hold them on account of the people, because they were all glorifying God for what had happened. For the man was more than 40 years old on whom this miracle of healing had been performed." And so they did the threaten, they did the intimidation, but the response of Peter and John was, we can't stop speaking. Okay, and the way it was worded, whether or not this is something that we should, obey God or man, this is a good question, but they put it aside. It's not a confrontation between, well, God told us to do this, and you told us to do this, well, we're going to have to obey God. They even set that aside. They said, we just can't stop. Something so amazing happened to them. Think about it. They followed Jesus for years. They believed he was the Messiah. They watched him teach. They learned from him. They saw the miracles. They were expecting the kingdom of God to be started right in their lifetime. And then what happens? Jesus dies. Turns the world upside down. And then he's get raised from the dead. He's back. And then he ascends up into heaven. And then they get filled with the Holy Spirit. And then Gentiles are now coming to them, believing in their God, in the God of Abraham. Everything is coming together to a point where they start to comprehend what the gospel message is. And their response is, how can we stop from speaking? This is something bubbling up from the inside. It's just sometimes life is so amazing, we can't hold it in. We've got to tell someone. We've got to tell anyone, everyone. Now, have you ever been around that person? That person, who just came back from this trip to this exotic land, or they just came back from a project where they worked with this iconic person, and they just can't shut up. They keep telling you, well, we did this and we did that, and you ought to see that. Every conversation just gets veered towards this amazing experience that they just had. Have you ever been that person? You understand what it's like when life is so exciting, you can't bottle it up. It has to come out, and you have to tell somebody. Now, I want to give you a little thought experiment. I want you to think about this. Okay, sometime in the night, your mind is racing. You know how that works. You can't sleep, and you just got these ideas bubbling around, and all of a sudden, you have this epiphany. And something occurs to you. You now have the solution to some important world problem. In your mind, you've now realized the cure for cancer. Okay, you have, somehow, whatever it is, you've got this knowledge, and you know it's life-changing. So what do you do with it? Oh, well, that's nice to know. Maybe tell your friends. You maybe write a book about it. No, you're not. You know exactly what you're going to do. You're going to go and tell everybody. You're going to post it on Facebook. You're going to go call whatever authorities you know and say, hey, have you heard that? Have you thought about this? Have you tried this? Okay, this can change lives. This is so far beyond me. So what kind of response are you going to come across? Realistically thinking. Let's just say you have a cure for cancer. The critics are going to jump on you immediately. Who are you? What doctorates do you have? What research have you done? You don't have the qualifications to make any such statements. Who has tested your ideas? Where are the focus groups? Where are the double-blind tests? Where have we done all this research to show that those ideas are safe and valid? This is not the way we do things. You're upsetting the balance. All these things, if you had powerful, life, world-changing knowledge, you would run up against so many different barriers. And your response would probably still be the same. I got to tell. I got to speak. I got to share. So is there anything in our lives that compared to that? And if the answer is no, I just have to ask why. Think about our faith. Is that so boring that there's nothing within our lives, within our relationship with God, within our experience in this world, there's nothing that just is exciting, that fills you with joy, that fills you with this need to share? First of all, a life influenced by the gospel message will be filled with vision and hope. Okay, and if you look around you, I don't know about where you live, but there's a lot of that lacking in our world. Of just having a hope for the future and a vision for how things can be, and even a plan for how we can make changes in our lives to have an impact now. Even if you don't change the world, but hey, if everyone did this, it would change the world. And second, a life well lived will spill over. It will overflow, and it will affect everybody around you. Being bold, being confident is contagious. It doesn't stay with you. It gets spread. It gets shared. Now, there's one, I want to read it's a passage. To me, it's a little complex. It's a little repetitive. I'm guessing it just doesn't translate very well. In 1 John chapter 4, the heading, for that paragraph is God is love. And if you read through this before, you understand, sometimes you really got to stop and try to put it in the perspective of what he's saying. 'Cause to me, it just doesn't translate well into English. Other than, You should be good to each other. But in John chapter 4 and verse 11, starting verse 11, it says, Beloved, if God so loved us, we ought to love one another. No one has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. By this we know that we abide in him, and that he is in us, because he has given us of his Spirit. We have seen and testified that the Father has sent the Son to be the Savior of the world. So, we can't see God. But when we care for each other, we can catch a glimpse of him. It's that notion of God is present in us. He lives in us. And that our faith and the guidance of the Spirit is the evidence that God is living with us. And that's kind of a theme that he repeats throughout this passage, verse 15. Whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, and God abides in him, and he is in God. We have come to know and have believed the love which God has for us, that God is love, and that one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. And again, it's a little repetitive, and sometimes it's hard to figure out what he's actually saying. But by this, love is perfected with us, so that we may have confidence in the day of judgment, because as he is, so also are we in the world. Repeating the notion of God abiding in us, that love is that conduit that allows this to happen. Being loved by God should bring us confidence. And that statement at the end, I still try to wrap my mind about what it means. That as he is, so are we in the world. He's placing a lot of trust in us. That as we are in the world, as he is, we are, in a way, we're his representative. In a way, we're the one who stands in his place. There's some high expectations for that. Verse 18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. We love because he first loved us. If someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, that the one who loves God should love his brother also. There's some very practical applications to what he's saying there, and I think that's something we can all sink our teeth in and understand. How we treat each other matters greatly. When someone walks into our church, what is the first thing they notice? How obedient we are, how humble we are, maybe how generous we are. First thing they should notice is how we treat each other, that we love each other. We treat each other with respect and with genuine caring for one another, and crossing all different social barriers that there might be. It is the evidence of God's presence in our lives, and that we should love like God loves us, but we should also love others like God loves us. Got two different perspectives there. It's the hallmark of our faith, and this is the evidence to know that God's presence is in your life, of how you treat each other. And that realization that God is in us, and this is some deep theology. Sometimes it stretches our mind to realize what he's really trying to tell us. He lives in us. He abides in us. We're his representatives. We are his embodiment. We're called the body of Christ for a reason. And, is it just metaphor, or is it that his presence in the world comes through us? How does he touch people? He uses flesh and blood hands. He uses people who are called according to his purpose. Now, that's an empowering thought. On one hand, it's also a heavy responsibility. He's not just helping us grow in grace and knowledge. He's investing in us. And we understand he's investing part of his Spirit in us. This is something he is pouring energy into. His Spirit, his love, even his will. And that we are a reflection of him. We are a representation of him. So with that in mind, I'm going to wrap up where I started. I'm going to go back to Hebrews. We're going to go a few chapters later in chapter 10. This is the same author. He has made a couple more statements, but again, I'm going to break into a conclusion where he says, therefore, he likes that word. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 19, therefore, brethren, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which he inaugurated for us, through the veil, that is, through his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with sincere heart, in full assurance of the faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Now let's keep going. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope, without wavering, for he who promised us is faithful. Let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembly together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. In conclusion, our faith should make us confident. Through his life and through his death, it says he made a better way. And as we grow in our faith, we do understand our sins are forgiven. We have been washed clean. The human nature that has that grip on us that we struggle with, we understand in the end it will not win. And even though we're going to fail from time to time, there will be mercy. There will be grace. There will be forgiveness. When we share in his ministry, when we sacrifice, when we suffer for the gospel's sake, when we suffer in service of others, we become family. We are sharing in his ministry. We are sharing in his rewards. Conclusion. Our faith should make us bold. We should be, when you read this, you understand we're giving access to the throne of God. When you stop and think about that for a moment, you ever been in a courtroom? You ever seen when, you come in one way and then a door opens and the judge comes out and the bailiff comes out, and when they're done, they go back through that door, and you know full well you do not run through that door. You go through that door and they will not let you out for a while. If you've ever been in a room where you have a door with the sign that says authorized personnel only, you understand, you don't go through there unless you have the credentials. We are authorized personnel to God. From his perspective, you can come to him at any time before his throne. We should live our lives in a way that's a little more adventurous than the average person. We should be bold. We should dare to do great things. We should have the courage to follow our calling, to follow where the Spirit is leading us, knowing we may look foolish, we may fail, but God said he'll be there. He's going to back us up. He's going to carry the slack. His grace should ease our fears because he has our back. And we should learn to trust where the Spirit guides us. In conclusion, our faith should make us share. This is something that doesn't stay contained. Being called as a church together means we share that confidence. We know not all of us have strong faith at all times. We come in, we're great, we're feeling fine, someone else is down. We share. We make sure they get that feeling overflows from us into them. We lift them up, and we know full well they're going to do the same for us. It should be contagious. It should be something that spreads. It should be something that part of experiencing the love of God is bringing it along and making sure everyone who knows God, every believer, has it as well. And one more thing. As the salt of the earth, we should boldly go and share that love to the rest of the world.